Hello, and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast, which today is going to be reviewing episode 1 of Salmond and Sturgeon, A Troubled Union. This is a 2-part BBC documentary. It's just come off air. We are here with instant analysis, but before we get into anything too heavy, Alex, let's just remind the good folks who have tuned in, how can they support the podcast?
Well, that is obviously an excellent question, Bernard. Indeed, it's one of the most pressing questions of our time. There are a number of ways, mercifully, in which people can support the podcast. First, of course, they can subscribe to it on Apple or Spotify or any other podcast platform. They can also subscribe to our YouTube feed or follow us on our Facebook page. Those are all very easy things to do. If they are enjoying the podcast, we would urge them to recommend the podcast to other people, to friends, family, even to foes. And there are a number of ways you could also help the podcast. You could leave a review on Apple or Spotify or anywhere else and so on. If you do that, please leave a positive one, because that does make a difference to the Apple rankings. And of course, if you're a business, a big player in corporate Scotland, or even a medium-sized player in corporate Scotland, there are all sorts of sponsorship opportunities that are available to you if you'd like to support the podcast and reach what we like to think of as being a discerning and growing and significant audience of movers and shakers in Scottish politics and public life.
Yeah. Right, let's get into it. Salmond and Sturgeon, A Troubled Union. Now, I think the first thing I should do, in the interest of complete transparency, is to say, and anyone who was watching the credits will have noticed that I was a series consultant. Now, what did that actually mean? I met with the production team, the people that were putting these 2 1-hour documentaries together. We discussed some of the ground, and they picked my brain politically about certainly the 2 chief protagonists in this documentary, and also for some of the political issues that it covered. I did not do any interviews for this series. I didn't put the program together. I didn't sit in the edit suite. I wasn't supervising the dub. I had no editorial input in that sense, but my view about certain issues was canvassed. So that's me with my declaration.
Yes, and I should say that I also met with the production team, with the director, Barry, and series producer and so on, although I didn't receive a credit as a series consultant and so on, so I shall be taking that up with my sister, who happened to be an assistant producer on the programme, and so I shall have to have words with her about that. But so yes, we were both amongst a number of people whose views were canvassed, obviously, as part of the research for what is a serious programme made by Firecrest Films, for BBC Scotland. And I suppose, Bernard, having watched the first one's just finished, it's just come off air. What's your overall sense of what is, after all, and it's an extraordinary story, because although the programme is titled, Salmond and Sturgeon, A Troubled Union, it's actually a slightly wider ranging, more ambitious programme than just an analysis of their relationship, the rise and fall of that. But it's also takes in the entire modern history of the SNP, its remarkable journey from a party of outsiders with, fewer than a handful of MPs, to a position where for a generation it has been the dominant hegemonic party in Scottish politics. So it's a broad sweep of history, as well as an analysis of the Salmond-Sturgeon relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a sense, what they're trying to do is ride 2 horses here. They're trying to chart the genesis of this relationship, when they first got together, and as the programme indicates, that was in the late 80s, early 90s, particularly 1990, when Alex Salmond became SNP leader, defeating Margaret Ewing, despite the fact Margaret Ewing was the establishment candidate in that election. And of course, Nicola Sturgeon was very active in the Young Scottish Nationalists. And in a sense, Salmond's being elected leader first time around was as a result of the YSN, who were a sort of insurgency movement at that time against the party establishment. And their radar, Nicola Sturgeon came on Alex Salmond's radar at that particular point. So it's charting this relationship through the history of the party, right the way through. In episode 2, we'll deal with the referendum and the fallout. But as you say, it's also dealing with historical matters. But because it's looking at these historical matters really through the prism of their relationship, by definition, there's quite a lot of ground which, in terms of a historical sweep, it doesn't cover. And I suppose that raises a question when people put programs like this together. What's the target audience? Are they making this program for political anoraks who will probably watch it 5 times over and take a note of everything that everybody is saying? Or is this a program which is being made for the broader public to give them a sense of what was going on in historical terms and to get inside this relationship? It's part historical record, but I would say limited historical record because there are some, I think, important issues which it doesn't cover because that's not what they were seeking to do. And it's part docu-soap, the way in which it's directed and edited with all of these close-ups from the side when they're looking pensive, occasionally looking worried, occasionally staring into the distance. The whole editing style, in a sense, is there to buttress the drama of this particular relationship. So it's doing two things. I think it's very accessible. I think it's extremely well put together, I have to say that. But in terms of the broad sweep of issues it covers, from a historical point of view, it's quite narrow.
Yes, I mean there are certain things that don't receive the treatment that perhaps as a 400-page political history of the period would devote considerable attention to. For instance, the wrangling over the Scottish Constitutional Convention and the SNP's role within that, the SNP's reluctance actually to take part in it in the end, withdrawal from the convention doesn't really receive much, if any, mention. And the, if you like, the architecture of the creation of devolution, which is vital to the SNP's ascent, isn't, there is a nod to that certainly, but it doesn't receive perhaps quite the same amount of attention as it would if the program didn't also have this second strand, as you say, which is focusing very much on the relationship between Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond. And Salmond, obviously, for a long period, is the dominant figure in that. And you have this sense of them being eventually like sort of, cable cars. One cable car is going up the mountain. That is Nicola Sturgeon's on. And at some point, it passes the other cable car, which is coming down the mountain, which is Alex Salmond. And that moment of transference comes in 2014, obviously, when Nicola Sturgeon becomes leader of the SNP and then takes the SNP to even higher, greater heights than anything that Salmond had done, at least in terms of the Westminster election in 2015. But I think they are also correct, aren't they, to note that how improbable in certain respects the SNP's rise was. If you go back to 1987, even after the Govan by-election, of which you know a great deal, Bernard, obviously, you would be hard pushed to say that one day, the SNP is going to be the dominant force in Scottish politics. It was a very improbable rise in many ways that rested on a combination of factors and circumstances. Some of it, obviously, the way Alex Salmond managed to lead the party and reposition the party, but some of it also due to events out with the SNP's control, and but upon which they were able to capitalise. And that's something that, again, for understandable reasons, perhaps the programme makers don't focus on so much. Those external events that aren't directly linked with Salmond and to a lesser degree Sturgeon herself.
Yeah, I mean, if we get into the sort of program itself, it is in editing terms, it's not a linear program. I mean, to a certain extent, the story in relation to Salmond and Sturgeon, they start with his election as Member of Parliament for Banff-and-Buchan when he defeated Albert Macquarie in 1987. With Nicola Sturgeon, it's 1986 when she joins the SNP. Now, of course, the political journey that the SNP were on and the underlying reasons why they made the progress that they did, that didn't start in 1986 or 1987, but again, it's not attempting to be a broad historical sweep. And because it's not done in a linear way, it actually the program starts with that sense of drama of Alex Salmond being cleared of sexually assaulting 9 women. And there's all those close-up shots of them trying to sort of convey something of the emotion which is underpinning the broken nature of this relationship. And then it goes back to Alex Salmond's decision to go to Westminster in 2015, which of course coincides with Nicola Mania. And then it goes all the way back after it covers these relatively recent events. It goes all the way back to the beginning to tell the story. So the story does, in that sense, jump about actually quite a bit. And they've done that essentially for dramatic purposes. For some people, that will have assisted the production, that will have made it more engaging. For others who are political anoraks, who like everything in a linear fashion, it may well irritate. But I think if we could just pick up again, because the program is Salmond and Sturgeon, so it's focusing on the personalities. Right at the top, Alex Salmond's former chief of staff, Jeb Aberdeen, talks about meeting with Salmond and with pleading with him not to go to Westminster in 2015. And there's almost a sense in which people thought that after 2014, when he resigns after the referendum, if he goes to Westminster in 2015, the worry is that he will attempt to be a backseat driver. And some of the staffers who were working at Westminster, Katrina Matheson, saying that there was a sense in which here was this there was this big beast who wasn't going to, if you like, disappear into the background. And we have the flip side of that, where we have the Nicola the rock star. And Rosanna Cunningham, who was very, very close to Nicola Sturgeon, going all the way back to the 1980s, in some respects the closest political relationship that Nicola Sturgeon had, says of that entire period where there was this round the country, all of these meetings, Nicola the tour, the T-shirts, the venues on the back of the T-shirts. And Rosanna Cunningham very, very interestingly says, a number of us were actually saying when this was going on, who is this person? Who is this person? Nicola the rock star. That's quite instructive, I would suggest, because Rosanna Cunningham knows her better than anyone else. And therefore you have this sense that it is at this time that people think, and Kenny McCaskill, who was emceeing some of these, says in the program that he was deeply uneasy because he felt that there was a cult of personality growing at this particular point.
Yes, and that obviously also is an echo of some of the questions that were raised about Salmond's leadership of the SNP in his first spell as leader, where there was again the sense that the SNP was too dependent on him, that it was Alex's way or the highway, and there was no real sense of internal debate. Now, it's fair to say that Salmond would dispute this, and that in the devolution era, I think it is also fair to say that Salmond appreciated that the SNP had to be more than a one-man band. Indeed, he says so on the programme, that you had to have a team of people to show that the party was ready for government. And that was something I think that worked to the SNP's favour in the 2007 Holyrood election. There was a sense that the SNP team then was stronger than the Labour Liberal Democrat team. But yes, the way they open with this question of what do we do essentially with Salmond after he's stepped down from the leadership and so on, and that is a problem for political parties very frequently. What does the former leader do? What is their role? I mean, you think of somebody like, Ted Heath had a 30-year incredible sulk, never getting over being replaced by Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher herself, having been defenestrated by her own party, subsequently made life very difficult for John Major on a number of occasions as a backseat driver, and there were obvious concerns, I think, amongst people close to Nicola Sturgeon, that Salmond might have some of the same interfering qualities. I think that did happen. And one of the dynamics in the collapse of the Salmond-Sturgeon relationship is partly that it's not clear to me that Alec ever really came to terms with the fact that he was not the number one dog in the nationalist movement anymore. And people close to Nicola, I'm not suggesting Nicola Sturgeon herself, but some of the people close to her, I think, were acutely concerned by the way Salmond had the potential to destabilize things, to command too great a share of the spotlight himself, because you have people close to Nicola Sturgeon who are extremely loyal to her. And you have the Salmond acolytes who are extremely loyal to him. So you have these sort of warring houses that are, these two big beasts that are very wary of one another in the period after which he steps down as leader and is succeeded by Sturgeon, and they can't quite find a way of living together, actually, because their roles have changed, and it's not clear to me that Salmond really understood that he was in some ways yesterday's guy.
Yeah, if you were taking notes on this, you certainly would have noted Rosanna Cunningham's comment about where has Nicola gone, because Rosanna Cunningham is really saying that some within the party did not recognise this individual who was leading the party, and if you like, that it was overly focused on personality. And of course, people have subsequently said that she ran a very, very tight ship, that people were kept out of decision making at senior levels of the party. And that was a very frequent criticism that you got from SNP MSPs. But when the programme goes all the way back to the late 80s, early 90s, we have an interview again with somebody that Alex Salmond was very close to them, Jim Sillars. And Jim Sillars actually, I think, is quite underused in the program. I think there's only about 2 clips of him. But Jim Sillars said in his first clip in the program, when he's holding an old picture, and I think it's a platform which he and Alex Salmond are sharing, he says, Alex had the X factor. That is the quote that Jim Sillars gives. He had the X factor. And of course, both Jim Sillars and Alex Salmond had been together in the 79 group. Now, this is a period which the programme doesn't cover, but the 79 group is quite important because although it was an internal group which was disbanded, and indeed Alex Salmond was expelled from the SNP because of his membership of the 79 group. The legacy, in a sense, of the 79 group is that it forced the SNP to debate where it stood on the political spectrum. And this, of course, is a theme which really takes off after Salmond wins the leadership in 1990. But you would have thought, would you not, that Jim Sillars would have been a natural supporter of Alex Salmond back in 1990 because they had been in the 79 group. They both regarded themselves as politicians of the left. But in the second clip of Jim Sillars in the programme, in relation to the 1990 leadership contest between Alex Salmond and Margaret Ewing, Sillars backs Margaret Ewing because he says that he just felt at that time that Alex Salmond exhibited, and I quote, autocratic tendencies. Now, the interesting thing is, if again you fast forward about 30 years, some of these criticisms are criticisms which some people within the SNP would have made of Nicola Sturgeon. So, although people say they're different people by temperament, maybe not wildly different in terms of their politics, you get a flavour here that both like to exercise control. And these are the observations, not of the programme makers, these are the observations of people who were colleagues.
Absolutely, and there's a sense of the apprentice emulating and then surpassing the master in some of these respects. I mean, there's one of the other things about the program. There's a lot of tremendous archive footage. The researchers at Firecrest have done a great job on that. And one of the things that struck me, and put this to you, Bernard and Zod, is it becomes very obvious when you're looking at the SNP in the 1980s, 1990s, and so on. It is a very different type of party to what it is now, and the language used is very, very different. There's a splendid clip of Gordon Wilson, Salmond's predecessor as leader, speaking at SNP conference, and he's talking of freedom and essentially national liberation. These are not terms that the SNP uses these days. There's again a clip of Salmond when he wins election in 1987 and is elected as the MP for Banff-and-Buchan. And he's talking about, the English, explicitly, the English are the problem. And again, that is language that has been excised from the SNP dictionary these days. They no longer talk about that. They will talk about Westminster and other things and so on. But the language of the SNP has evolved enormously over the years, and that I would suggest has been a vital contributor to its success, actually.
Yeah, because certainly under Alex Salmond's leadership, what it was essentially attempting to do, and I think the programme does point this out and it allows Alex Salmond space to develop this argument, is that they had moved from, in a sense, a pressure group in the 1970s, albeit a pressure group with a very, very clear political aim, to a political party which took a position on the political spectrum. And because it owned up to a political ideology, it made it possible, when the circumstances were right, that when Labour voters had doubts about the Labour Party, they could move across to the SNP without feeling any sense of ideological betrayal, because they were comfortable with the Nationalists, because they were comfortable with their position on the political spectrum. That was really the journey that Alex Salmond made. And in a sense, I think his key historical legacy, quite apart from getting the referendum and getting pretty close in the referendum in 2014, is that he endowed the SNP with a political philosophy which made it possible to get that result in 2007 and then the landslide in 2011. But as the programme goes through some of these elections, again, it has a tendency to look at events through the prism of the relationship rather than offering a lot of analysis of the events in particular. And in the 1999 election, for example, there's quite a lot of detail on the war in Kosovo. It was, above all, an act of dubious legality and unpardonable folly, is what Alex Salmond said in that famous broadcast, which led Robin Cook to say that he was the toast of Belgrade. And that's used because there's then clips of the current First Minister, John Swinney, essentially just shaking his head about the language. And of course, there is a sense that people within the party think, why is he going off on one? Why is he gambling with this right on the eve of the first elections to the parliament? Because there's no doubt that issue put the party on the back foot. And here again, we see that Salmond is a politician who is not afraid to take risks with issues if he thinks that this is the correct line to take. But you've got sort of people in the background in the party who are throwing up their hands in horror because they know that there are going to be consequences in terms of the result in 99.
Absolutely. And, I think there were other things that contributed to what was considered to be a disappointing performance by the SNP in the first elections to the Scottish Parliament. I think the SNP's manifesto promised to put a penny on income tax that would be, so-called penny for Scotland, was something that played poorly with voters. And I think that had just as big an impact, perhaps a bigger impact even than the Kosovo debate, about which Salmond, incidentally, still says he was right, which is quite an interesting view and an unfashionable view now. And you're also right there to draw attention, I think, to John Swinney and him sort of say, what on earth were we doing there? And Swinney's interviews are very interesting in the whole program, because you get a persistent sense that Swinney is much, much more cautious than either Alex Salmond, which is not a surprise, perhaps. Salmond has always had a reputation as a gambler, and John Swinney, shall we say, is not a natural Las Vegas type politician. But Swinney is also much more cautious about than Nicola Sturgeon. So there's a sort of gear change towards the end of the first episode, and so where they then look at major constitutional upheaval, this great earthquake of Brexit, and Nicola Sturgeon immediately pivots within an hour of the result being confirmed. Nicola Sturgeon whacks the second referendum back on the table and so on, says that Scotland must have the opportunity to choose, must have the right to choose. And you have John Swinney saying that this made him very, very nervous. He says he was concerned at how we would persuade people that it was time to that this was the right time to have a second independence referendum when we had only just had a referendum on independence. And that I think is quite revealing. I think it tells us something about how John Swinney will approach his remaining time as First Minister, whether that extends beyond 2026 and the Holyrood elections then or not. And you have this sort of sense of Swinney being much more worried, if you like, about public opinion and Middle Scotland, perhaps less confident that he can lead or shape or mould public opinion than either Salmond or Sturgeon.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I did actually note that one down. So again, in 99, you have a situation where Alex Salmond takes an issue in Kosovo, Penny for Scotland, all that kind of stuff, not afraid to take what were clearly gambles. And to get back to that point which you've just raised, I think that Nicola Sturgeon says in the programme, as it became clear that Brexit was going to happen, I went up to my study in Bute House and started to write the speech that she gave that day, which was effectively paving the way to demand a second independence referendum. And as you said, John Swinney said that he was saying you have to be cautious about opening this up, because once you put something in the public domain, you put it in the public domain as a strategy. The issue then becomes how you're going to deliver that strategy. And in the issue of a second referendum, it can only be delivered with Westminster's consent. So Swinney was saying, just be cautious about pursuing that particular line. So again, I mean, in that particular press conference at Bute House, where she paves the way for this, some people within the party would say that's a bit gung-ho at this stage. I mean, the sense in which, it was clearly a calculated risk. And again, this is an example of a characteristic which perhaps in this circumstance she shared with Alex Salmond. But as the programme draws to an end in terms of the first episode, so we have the second referendum strategy, which comes the day after the Brexit referendum. John Swinney is saying to the programme very candidly, this is playing badly on the doorstep in 2017. At the 2017 election, it is playing badly, and there is a sense in which you have to pull back. Alex Salmond is telling the programme that in actual fact, 2017 was not independence light in terms of the SNP campaign. It was independence zero. So he clearly has big problems with the campaign in 2017. And there is a sense in which, and I don't think that there was any jaw-dropping moments in this entire first episode, but of course, Alex Salmond loses his seat. There is a sense in which John Swinney is saying the line which emerged after that Brexit vote is not playing well. Salmond perhaps feels that he's been let down. And then Nicola Sturgeon says that after his defeat, she tried calling him for 2 weeks and then she gave up. And you think, well, there certainly is probably more than the genesis of a sense of unease in that relationship, because clearly Salmond believed that the strategy which she was pursuing, or the non-strategy he would probably put it, in part led to the SNP going back the way in 2017.
Absolutely. And one of the other interesting things about that election was, you have Nicola Sturgeon saying, well, I had a bad feeling about that election anyway. Now, in one sense, that is reasonable. The SNP were defending 56 out of 59 constituencies. It would be almost impossible for them to have a better result than in 2015. And of course, 2017, was a reaction to 2015. So you had unionist voters, or voters who are opposed to independence, coalescing around whichever candidate of whichever party happened to be best placed in a given constituency to defeat the SNP incumbent. So you had people moving from Liberal Democrats to Conservatives, or from Conservative to Labour. So Sturgeon was probably right to feel apprehensive about that election. But it also reflected the fact that the referendum bounce, the bounce the SNP got from Brexit, was neither as large nor as sustained as I think she had thought it would be, or indeed as many external commentators thought it would be. And I confess to having overestimated the extent and size of that bounce myself. So the programme then also concludes with some of these things, and you're right, you get this sort of intimation of trouble ahead.
Yeah.
And, Alex Salmond, talking about the post-Brexit era and 2017, he says very bluntly, I didn't rate the team around Nicola. And that there, again, is another little harbinger of things that will unfold in the second episode, and the destruction, the permanent destruction of the relationship between the two people who, more than anybody else, both built the modern SNP and cemented its place as the dominant political party in Scotland for a generation.
Yeah, because she says, I gave up trying to contact him after the 2017 defeat. And she then says that she felt punished. And I think that one of the things that was clear in terms of body language throughout the 1 hour is that the sense of discomfort, sadness, hurt that Nicola Sturgeon felt, I think you can read that into her face. Alex Salmond, on the other hand, tends to be very matter of fact. And I would suggest that the reason he's very matter of fact is that he finds it difficult to express any degree of sadness because he thinks that the subsequent events that followed were in part orchestrated by people close to the First Minister or the former First Minister. But that is an issue for episode 2. That's been the review of episode 1.
Yes, so we will have reflections on episode 2, which is out in a couple of days' time, and we shall, during which we shall cover, the independence referendum, the period of Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister, and of course the great falling out, the great drama, the sort of Shakespearean tragedy in certain respects of how Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, as I say, the two dominant creatures in Scottish politics over the last 20 years. And the decline and destruction of their relationship and the ruin that has for the SNP more generally. But for now, until we see the second episode, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.